And welcome back, listeners. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of The Invisible Threat. I am joined here, as is normal, with Dr. Matt Eby, coming in from warming up, hopefully, Kansas City, Kansas. Shawnee, you're in Johnson County, aren't you?
We are in Johnson County, yeah. And it is unseasonably warm here, 72 degrees here yesterday. So unbelievable.
You know, it's interesting, Matt, whenever I grew up in Kansas City, I was there from the time I was 10 to like 28, 29. You know, the ongoing theme was, if you don't like the weather, just wait 15 minutes, right? So I believe the last time we recorded a podcast, it was like, you know, a foot of snow outside and it was like 3 below zero or something like that, something crazy.
You know, it's one of those things where there's always a question whether or not you're going to shovel your driveway or shovel your sidewalk, because you might just be able to wait and have the, you know, over the beautiful sun over the top just melted for you. But this time we did have to shovel and be polite to our neighbors. But anyway, so yeah, so there's always a question.
Speaking of shoveling, I always like to use this phrase of shoveling sunshine. I'm out here in, you know, Scottsdale, Arizona. It's been phenomenal. It's been an amazing winter. And I don't normally like to toot my own horn, but as you are already fully aware, I had a very big, another timestamp moment here. I had a big event, a pretty significant feat happen yesterday as a golfer. And anybody that's listening to this, if you're a golfer, you'll appreciate this. And I was playing golf with a couple of stalwarts in my space, in the IMO, FMO, you know, insurance world, that it was really an honor to be able to play golf with them. Well, lo and behold, on hole number 5, I made my third. I'm not trying to brag on third here. Hole in one. So it was a really big deal for me yesterday. But the biggest deal for me is not only with these two great, wonderful, amazing industry influencers, if you will, but I also had Carter Samuel, my son, who was there as well. And it was actually him, because I didn't get to see it go in the hole. Nobody did, because it was a tucked away pin. You couldn't see it. He was the one that was like, Dad, what ball are you playing? So he was the one that discovered my hole in one. So that was pretty cool.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Congratulations. And I was going to say that he's going like, I'm pretty sure your son was there with you, and there's nothing better than that. So congratulations. That's so fantastic. I'm glad you shared that with the listeners.
Matt, I'm really excited about kicking off this next episode and everything. And I'll kind of let you get started maybe a little bit, and then we'll just go from there. How's that sound today?
That's great. I think that was a great intro, because as you remember in our last episode, I thought it was pretty well done. And we talked about something that is, you know, usually makes people very, very uncomfortable. I shared it with my sister, and I thought she was going to pass out when she was sitting watching that episode. We discussed disagreement, and, you know, not disagreement as conflict or disagreement as failure, but disagreement as a sign that people are still thinking, that they haven't brought closure to the discussion. They're still weighing things. They're still holding more than one responsibility at a time. And that the idea tends to land, and then it raises an uncomfortable question. You know, okay, but does what we talked about in that last episode, in episode 2, really hold when the conversation really, really matters? You know, when there's pressure, when you're talking to somebody who has authority, and when the stakes aren't just theoretical. You know, in fiduciary work, those moments don't usually show up as arguments. They show up as serious conversations, calm ones, professional ones, the kind where nothing is technically wrong, but something still feels unsettled. So instead of explaining anything today, listeners, we're just going to let you hear the conversation, to listen to it. What you're about to experience is a conversation that could happen in any trust department, in any trust company, and maybe you've actually experienced this yourself. No villains, no misconduct, just people doing their jobs and probably doing it very well. But pay attention to the moment when the conversation starts to tighten. That's where the real signal is. Carter, we're going to demonstrate a conversation between an examiner and management during a meeting towards the end of their regulatory exam. You okay with that?
I am okay with that, and I'm ready to go.
Let's go. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. Before we get into the specifics in this meeting, I want to be clear about the purpose of this conversation. This isn't about the single exercise of discretion, and it isn't about identifying a specific violation. What we're looking at, Carter, is management's oversight.
Well, of course, and we take that very seriously. And just to say it up front, we've reviewed the preliminary comments, and we don't see a breakdown in controls. Our team has followed policy. We've been consistent all along the way.
I agree. We're not seeing control failure, and that's exactly why this conversation matters.
Okay, can you help me understand what you're seeing then?
Across several trust files, not one, but a pattern. We're seeing discretionary actions that are technically sound, they're documented, and they're compliant. But the rationale looks increasingly uniform.
When you say uniform, like how and in what way?
The explanations read the same, even when the individual circumstances don't.
Well, Matt, consistency is intentional. It's part of how we manage fiduciary risk.
I understand that. So let me ask this in a little bit of a different way. When two beneficiary requests differ materially, what would you expect to see reflected in the account file?
Well, we'd expect the explanation to align with the trust terms, our policies, and precedent.
Right. That's pretty standard.
Well, that's exactly why we rely on policy. It keeps discretion from becoming too subjective.
What I'm trying to understand is how interpretation is being exercised inside your structure.
Well, Matt, interpretation happens, but within the guardrails that we've established for years.
Of course, but here's what concerns us. In several cases, the discretionary authority in the trust, in the document itself, was broad enough to support more than one reasonable outcome. Yet the explanation consistently resolved towards the same one.
Well, Matt, I'm going to say this again. It's because consistency matters for us, especially under examination.
Well, Carter, consistency matters, but so does responsiveness to the context. And those two don't always point in the same direction.
Now, Matt, don't tell me what you're actually saying here is that we should be less consistent.
I'm saying we're trying to understand how interpretation is occurring within that discretionary process.
Okay. From our perspective, take that for what it's worth. That sounds like increased risk.
Well, why would you say that?
Well, because variability is hard to defend.
That's an important answer.
Look, our trust officers are thoughtful. They care deeply about the beneficiaries, but they also know they're accountable for exercising that meaningful discretion. When explanations vary too much, questions start getting asked.
By whom?
Well, auditors, examiners such as yourself, sometimes even trust committees or the board.
So if I understand this correctly, the pressure in exercising discretion isn't really about the beneficiary or the trust. It's about how the work will be explained.
I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting bad faith. I'm saying that the context matters.
Well, Matt, there are conflicting obligations obviously at play here.
Exactly. And how those obligations get balanced shapes fiduciary judgment.
Let me be direct. Are you saying this is a Carter issue right now?
Well, Carter, as in representing management, I don't mean it specifically you yourself. But yes, it is a management issue.
So even though there are controls in place and have been for many, many years, and there's no violation?
Correct.
And even though our process is this very sound approach.
Yes.
Well, I'm not going to lie, Matt. That's really hard to hear.
I know. And I want to be careful here. This isn't about what actions were taken. It's about how the system is teaching people to exercise discretion.
Let me maybe reiterate here. We teach them to be prudent, to rely on the standards that we have already established and have established for years.
And prudence can mean different things. Sometimes prudence means caution. And sometimes prudence means discernment.
Discernment? Matt, discernment is subjective.
And so is judgment. That's why discretion exists.
But discretion without structure becomes basically unpredictable.
Agreed. But structure without interpretation becomes mechanical.
Let me ask you something. If every action is defensible, documented and compliant, what exactly is the risk you're seeing?
The risk is that judgment is being trained to resolve discretionary tension by default.
This is your theory? This is a theoretical?
It's not. When explanations start to sound thinner, when differences stop showing up in the record, when trust officers default to precedent before wrestling with purpose, judgment doesn't disappear. It just becomes harder to see.
We don't want any surprises, Matt.
And neither do we. But sometimes the absence of surprise is the signal.
We need to be careful about how this is characterized in the report.
I agree. And that concern, that instinct to manage how this looks, that's exactly what I want to talk about.
So what are you recommending? A change in our policies and our procedures?
Not a policy change, not a control enhancement. Neither of those is where the problem is. And it's not a corrective action. What we're pointing to is awareness.
Awareness of what?
Of when disagreement starts getting treated as something to eliminate instead of a signal to assess.
Okay, disagreement creates risk.
I agree. Sometimes that's true. And sometimes it's the last visible signal, the last visible sign that judgment is still active.
And if we disagree with that interpretation?
That's not a problem.
So what do you mean by that?
It tells us that this is a place where judgment still matters.
So where does that leave us?
That's not a question I want to answer too quickly. Nothing improper happened in that conversation. but something very important did.
So as we say, this is where most people stop. When judgment happens, we don't. I want to pause here because if you've been in a conversation like that, you probably felt it too. Nothing blew up. No one raised their voice. No rule was broken. And yet something shifted. In that moment, when the conversation tightens, when everyone is still being professional, but there's a tension in the air, you can feel the room start organizing around how will this look instead of what this actually requires. What's uncomfortable about moments like that is that there's no obvious mistake to point to. Just a tension listeners don't quite know what to do with. So we're not going to explain it and we're not going to resolve it. We're going to hold this tension. Because if disagreement really is a signal, and that's important, then moments like this are not something to rush through. They are something to notice. And again, as we say this all the time, most people move past this moment. We don't. And we'll pick it up from there the next time. Matt, I want to thank you for being my phenomenal esteemed co-host on the Invisible Threat podcast. Listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And please come back for the next episode. I promise you it'll be, I don't know, what should we say there, Matt? What do you think it'll be?
As enlightening as the others.
I love it. Awesome. Hey, Dr. Matt, thank you again so much. I really do enjoy these opportunities to pull all that stuff out of you. That was so wonderful for us to be able to really tie back into episode number 2. And we will obviously let the listeners get going. Thank you again, listeners, for joining us for another episode. And until next time, we will see you on the Invisible Threat podcast. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Carter. Can't wait for 4.